If you'd like to read the sermon, you can do that at raspberryman.wordpress.com. When this past summer we stayed at our friend's house in Lago Patria, a suburb of Naples in Italy, we felt really safe in the gated community in which they lived. In nearly a dozen homes lined the little neighborly and upscale street where mostly stationed officers and NATO personnel lived during their posting to the base there. We called it the Parco, the Italian word for park. An oasis it truly was. Now, lining the perimeter of the Parco was a tall wall. A large sliding metal door would guard entrance to this haven and then release us again to the urban jungle that is Naples, where stray dogs roamed and garbage lined the roadways. You get the picture. In Robert Frost's poem, Mending Wall, he wrestles with our desire to have clearly defined boundaries of what is my place and what is yours, and why we divide ourselves so. He concludes his poem with a challenge. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out. Good advice. Indeed, fences and walls serve to keep us from seeing what's out there. And perhaps we want it that way. We don't want to see what might disturb our comfort. We don't want to see who might be out there lurking on the perimeter of our safely constructed lives. We don't want to see because we're afraid of what truly seeing them might do to change, disrupt, and unravel us. The gospel text today from Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31 can unravel us for sure. A poor man named Lazarus makes his temporary home at the gate of a rich man's house, eating crumbs off the rich man's table. The story suggests that the rich man never even sees Lazarus is there, begging at his gate. Even in the afterlife, as the rich man burns in hell, he doesn't talk directly to Lazarus, referring to him only in the third person. Even serving his due in hell, the rich man still hasn't learned his lesson. Indeed, as Jesus says later in Luke, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. So how can the rich and the poor bridge the gap? How can we break down the barriers that separate us? How can we see better? By this I mean develop the eye of the heart and the mind. My brother tells the story of what happened at the beginning of the Clay gathering this past August. Clay, Canadian Lutheran Anglican Youth Gathering in PEI. All 900 participants did a certain exercise in the large group gathering that unnerved him, that unraveled him. They were asked, maybe Julia and Seth here can remember this if I'm getting it right. Everybody was asked to find someone they did not know, and then to go over to that person, sit next to them, and then turn to look directly into their eyes, and keep looking into their eyes for as long as possible without turning away. David said it's hard enough to do this sort of thing with someone you know well, let alone a complete stranger. So my brother David found a young person he didn't know, and the two of them, complete strangers, began to look into each other's eyes. It was unnerving. He felt vulnerable, exposed. While this was happening, the leader at the front said something like, "The person before you has a story. and has experienced happiness as well as sadness, perhaps even deep hurt and pain. Who knows? Life may have been very hard on the person in front of you. As these words were being said, David noticed the slightest hint of tears welling up in his partner's eyes. And he wondered, what's my partner's story? It said that the eyes are the window into the soul. In a sense, they were peering into each other's souls. A natural connection is formed. Two people connecting on a human level, affirming the fact that we're all united in our common humanity and life's experiences of sadness and laughter and humor, which we all go through at some point in our lives, no matter our differences in age, ethnicity, language, sexual orientation, or religion. I'm reminded of a quote attributed to Philo of Alexandria: "Be kind to everyone you meet. You don't know the battle they are fighting." Author and theologian Diana Butler Bass tells the touching story of what happened in an airport when she was flying from Albany, New York, to Washington, D.C. As you know, typically airports can be cold, heartless places where everyone seems absorbed in their own rushing around, wrapped up in their private worries, nerves, or plans, ignoring others around them. This time, as passengers milled around in the gate area before boarding the plane, there sat alone at the far end of the row of seats a middle-aged man. He looked distraught, perhaps ill. Maybe he needed help. His whole demeanor was one of sorrow, and he was bent over, slumped in his chair, as if falling toward the ground. Diana walked over to him and sat down beside him. She gently began asking him questions and listening to him. With deep, heavy sobs, he told her how he buried his wife that morning, and now he was going home to nothing. For the next half hour, he told Diana about his wife, her illness and untimely death. The man and his wife, they had no children. She had been his best friend since high school. Their parents had all passed away. He had taken her to be buried where they had grown up in New York State, a place they both loved. But most of their childhood friends had moved away. There had been no funeral, just him and a priest at a graveside to say a few prayers and goodbye. Now he was going home, back to work. Other than a few friends, he was alone. Diana listened and then went to him and to get him some water. On the way back, she found a flight attendant and told her about the man and his wife and how he had buried her that day. The flight attendant thanked her for sharing and said they'd take care of him. Now, there were only about 15 people on the flight that day on that small plane. Somehow word got around and soon everyone knew about their fellow passenger in mourning. By the time everyone was boarding the plane, people were going out of their way to be kind to the man. A crew member escorted him aboard. With courtesy and attention, they seated him at the back of the plane to be alone with his thoughts and whatever tears might come. When they landed, some silent agreement formed between the passengers to let him exit first. Instead of the usual rush and urgent calls on cell phones, everyone instead stood silently, forming two lines of respect as he walked down the aisle toward the cabin door. Some nodded respectfully as he passed. One woman reached out and touched his shoulder. When he reached the front of the plane, he turned back and looked at everyone to acknowledge the sympathy offered. The pilot came out of the cockpit and took the man's hand and together they descended the steps to the tarmac. All the passengers followed in silence. A private car, dispatched by the airline, waited there beside the plane to deliver him home. The irony is that no amount of gates, fences, walls, or clearly defined dividing lines, however they're constructed, will keep us separated from each other. When there is love, when we can see. Boundaries are important, but they don't guarantee the self-serving security we seek. Those friends we stayed at in Naples shortly after they were posted there a few years ago, our friend's house was broken into, despite the impressive protection their gated community seemed to provide. These kinds of gates are really only illusions, like the proverbial mirage in the desert. Gates and fences that separate the rich from the poor, the privileged from the underprivileged, the employed from the unemployed, the bum on the street and the senior executive in the top floor corner office are at best a mediocre interpretation of reality because they are constructed out of fear. Jesus is about breaking down those barriers, and we are called to bridge the apparent chasm separating us from each other. Better now in this world, while we can still do so, than whine about it like the rich man does in hell after it is too late. We are called to look into each other's eyes and see the connection we share with all of humanity in the love of God. We are called to work together like the community of care that formed on that short plane trip. We do not do this work by ourselves, individually, our own separate projects, not separately, but we work together at this task of reaching out and mending what has been broken. We do this in the mission of God, who broke down the greatest divide between God and human when Jesus was born a human child. When God became human, the ultimate gap was bridged. And now we live in that flow of God's love, continually binding us together and all people. Amen.